Thank you everybody for coming in this evening. My name is Brett Steele. For those of you that don't know us, that have come in from outside the school, I direct the AA School of Architecture. It's a real pleasure to kick off a new series, and I thought before introducing Michael this evening, I would first turn over to Attain Fitzpatrick, who will say something about this series, of which Michael's is the first of what we hope to be several in the coming years, please.
Hello, my name is Attain Fitzpatrick, and I am, this is beating back, the events coordinator for the AIA UK. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and most of all to thank our hosts, the Architectural Association, as well as Michael Gabellini for coming over from New York. I just wanted to say a few words about the AIA UK and what we do and what this series is about, because we're half students, half professionals here. The American Institute of Architects is a professional society of architects, and one of the things we provide for our members is opportunities to continue their professional education. Last year, the AIA celebrated its 150th year, and the AIA UK is actually the first international body of the AIA. So our former president decided, he conceived of this series, the Founding Lecture Series, as a way to commemorate the last 150 years, the achievements of the UK chapter, and a way of sort of looking forward, a way of expanding the achievements of this chapter. This particular mini-series is with Michael Gabellini and Eva Drinkna speaking next week, is really kind of fallen into the conception of a diptych, where both architects renowned in their fields work with space and light in very sculptural ways, but articulate it in very different ways. And also collaboration and influence of art is very important to their work. So again, next week is Ava's talk, and I invite you all to come. And I just wanted to mention that next Thursday, May 8th, we're having the Excellence in Design Awards Gala, and it will be held at the Winter Garden in Canary Wharf. It starts at 6:15, and the announcements for the design award winners will be made, and you're all welcome to come, and there'll be drinks and hors d'oeuvres. And I think that's about it. We're just logistics, but we're passing around forms to sign up for AIA credits. So make sure if you're AIA, you get to sign those forms. And please stay and join us for drinks and some snacks afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to welcome Michael this evening. In fact, to welcome him back to the AA after a few years away. Michael's a great choice. He's the first person for the series because, in fact, he has good close connections to not just the AIA, but also the AA, and of course to London, where he spent part of his time studying and training as an architect at a crucial stage in his career. Michael trained, as you all know, as both an architect and as an artist, and from that beginning, I think, has built a career in many ways around the relationship between contemporary art worlds, fashion worlds, and architecture. He's done that through his deep and dedicated interest in interior design, especially a topic that many of us here are extremely interested in for a number of reasons, but most especially for the way that the interior and the restoration of already existing interior spaces in various ways intersects not only architectural discourses and debates and discussions, but also very much those of fashion worlds and interior design. His office has practiced with clients that include Jil Sander, Giorgio Armani, Salvatore Ferragamo, Nicole Farhi, and many others in the fashion world, designing high-end boutiques, fashion houses, and showrooms. And on the other hand, worked also with such institutions as the Guggenheim Museum, the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum, Marion Goodman, and other private galleries in the art world. And I think Michael will give us an overview today of that work. Restoration projects by the office include his well-known observation deck project for the Rockefeller Center, the facades on the Fifth Avenue side of the Rockefeller Center. Here in London, they've worked on the Royal Bank Scotland project, and along the way amassed a vast portfolio of prizes and awards in architecture and interior design, including the 2006 National Design and Interior Design Award through the Smithsonian and the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum. The office seems to win every year a design award of some kind from the Interior Design Competition Awards. They are the recipient of the AIA National Honor Award in 2007, and of course have published their work and exhibited it worldwide. Gabbellini Sheppard was founded in the early 1990s after several years' work at Kohn Pederson Fox that Michael left to set up his own practice. He trained at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, in architecture and completed that degree, I believe, a year or two after first qualifying as an artist there. And along the path had an opportunity to spend a year or two here in this building at an interesting stage in its history, and particularly a stage at which I think the topic that's organized his work for many years came to fruition, which is, of course, the relationship between design in art worlds. Please join me in welcoming Michael Gabbellini.
It's nice to be here. London for me has been a kind of second home, or simply the best and easiest sort of way station from here east. And so I usually come through London probably at least once or twice every 6 to 8 weeks, and certainly also colleagues and associates from our office have used it quite well. And I mean, for me, this series, I don't know, it was dedicated in the way which as AIAAA. So when you try to tell people, what are you speaking at? I'm speaking at the AIAAA talk tonight. So for me, I mean, this is a little, I could say, reminiscent, but hopefully not a hint of nostalgia blended in. But I was here 78, 80, sort of at a heyday, coming from RISD and going into a very interesting sort of study, because I started out as a sculptor working in different sort of mediums, but always sort of abstractly with the land, and really not knowing what I was doing. Architecture struck me because at that time at RISD it was under the influence and a very theoretical base of the Argentinian school of Gandelsones and Agreste, Machado Silvetti, and a very strong overlay in terms of linguistic and sort of history of architecture, which for an American growing up, and also for a lot of my classmates that were American and not foreign, to really understand what a European city was and what culture actually is on the streets, was a very good sort of vantage point from which to begin sort of thinking about the public role that placemaking and space-making has in whatever generation, in whatever city, over a continuing evolving time. So in any event, I thought that it's very nice to be back here, but also to think about what I had thought originally was going to be a conversation with Ava. Ava is somebody that I know quite well, and I think a conversation could be quite nice. In any event, I found out that this was then split. My first reaction was, why did you bring the Yankee over first? Why didn't you have somebody from your own backyard begin to lay the groundwork for design? And this sort of meditation, I think, on space and light. Excuse me. So for tonight, I thought I would talk about the work of our studio to give you an introduction to it, because maybe some of you know of it in one project or two, but we have different platforms of design that we're working on. And for me, this is, through the project, a way in which to explore themes of spatial perception, sensory environments, and the relationship of history and modernity in contemporary design. Obviously, when you think of light and space, I mean, these are very pragmatic. It's like a theater. It's like when you have black space and you turn on a light bulb, you immediately have life. You have presence. There's something that you can manipulate with that. So for me, space is something that always has this narrative, which is attached to a very particular way which you think about a meditation of space, or the function that you place into space. So if I could say that our studio, while not setting aside more intellectual aspects of architecture or design, we certainly think about it in favor more of the phenomenological and emotional resonance that can be built or has been built into good space, or just normal space. Space that is unobjectified, and space that can just feel good to be in, or has a very good proportion in that whatever use, whether it's a private use or it's a series of private chambers that lead to a public area, that then there is a sense of space that has a use, a proportion, a function, but also in the end, when you set aside those things and you're living in space, that space has a resonance in the way in which you use it, so that space can, if properly thought about, also thinking not just interior but also exterior space, in the way in which you place a value on feeling good, or ascertaining a certain emotion, feeling bad within a certain space. So I thought I would just introduce from where we've been working from New York as an integrated design studio of about 40 professionals, both architects, interior designers, product designers, graphics, also lighting design, and the way in which we use ourselves to grow small, but then to network with a whole range of artisans, technical and creative consultants, now on a worldwide basis, but obviously as we started essentially from our backyard, knowing through whatever experiences or other jobs which I had or colleagues had, that the best way which to find about good people that can build, or good people that can think about building, that you find a way in which to integrate design from the ground, and not from, in the American education, usually in this way, from the ivory tower. So for me, we're completely sort of horizontal in the way which we're structured as a kind of, not really a collaborative, but what we refer to as a kind of open studio. And the way in which with these projects that we've had all over the world, then begin to build up a staff that is now serving the clients and the places that our projects are now in. So over the last 18 years, completing about 350 projects, in the way in which you start out with a kernel of understanding, or even a level of confidence when you're finally going out on your own with one job and no staff, and having one client who is not so dependable in providing you money, not design ideas. Those clients are numerous and supply many. But this is a way in which, for us as this, we refer to ourselves as this kind of like a small 40-person sort of ecosystem, in the way in which we grow ourselves small, but allow ourselves to kind of breathe and to kind of respire, also in a kind of business model, so that we have diverse platforms of design, from residential to product design to furniture, to lighting, to architecture, and the way in which then we can apply or get involved in different projects in different ways. We have 2 projects now, residential projects in the city, 2 townhouses, and on one of them we're the architect working with an interior design team, and on the other one we are the working with an architect working as the interior designers. So for us, in that way, it's the same, because we love this notion of design as something which should be thought about as sort of enhancing incrementally activities of daily life. So just to give you a little, where are we? This is where we are. We live in New York, just down from Washington Square, just above Soho, and here we are. So we just thought we'd give you a little introduction so you can put a face on that in our studio. And it's something which, for us, having a place in the city, we kind of refer to it as a sort of design sort of cockpit. And the way in which, through thick or thin, through when you have too much work or when you have too little work, the way in which you essentially sort of brave the storm, so to speak, of shedding employees, giving them to other colleagues while you are doing that. So what we love to revel in and have the opportunity to think about is design. And whether we're literally designing utensils for a company or for entering competitions or being invited, shortlist for a public space or urban park, for us, it is all the same. I have, in some cases, the unfortunate aspect of growing up the son of a artist and interior designer. So it's not that I didn't have any choice when I was young. It's just that my father, growing up in Pennsylvania, around Philadelphia, we lived in the country just a stone throws away from the Knoll factory that was founded by Walter and Florence Knoll, coming from Cranbrook. And so for me, in the country, in my backyard, was literally this beehive of American design modernism that came out of the school predominantly from Cranbrook, which, if you want to follow the arc back, goes directly back to the descendants and all the immigrants from Bauhaus. So it is kind of like this full circle in the way which in the design community, American design, in terms of modern design, is a fleeting thing. Here and in other places in Europe, there is more of a strain and more of a tolerance for design, good and bad, but how design should be something that can and will influence it and influence your life, again, in incremental or elemental ways. So for us, I thought I'd go through a survey of our work and pretty quickly, and then end with two projects, sort of feature projects for me, one small and one larger, both sort of a public dimension and how we've looked at those in different ways. For us and for me personally, I mean, residential work is nothing more that is the full exercise and is the full treat, but is also eminently the biggest and hardest nut to crack, because you are employed by some very precise nuts. Those are your clients, and those happen to be mine. But it's opportunities and exercise to think about for a couple, for their Manhattan loft, a simple space to be very open, very clean. And then also for their summer place, which is overlooking the water in Long Island, the way in which you can live also in this restored American farmhouse, 1840s, and elevating that. And the way in which residential design for us is the entire program. So it is something which, in terms of how you set up proportion or use of space, the way in which you set up adjacencies, the way in which, like Louis Kahn, who, if you really think about and look at his plans, probably had, as a designer, one of the more influential, let's say, critiques of the American nuclear family. And if you look at his plans, the way in which he would always separate children from their parents. Now think about your own background, and I certainly would have wanted my separate suite. And it's something which you think about the dynamics of family life and you think about the interior of a place, the home and not the house, and then you think about the overlay of the house as an object that has to be identified in terms of program, in terms of aspiration of what living can be, and how lifestyle for living can also be very basic, and really thinking about the whole ideas of bathing and sleeping and eating and lounging and entertaining and studying and living in your place. So what makes good housing from bad housing? It's planning, and it's the way which you think about the planning and distribute planning, and to consecutively, this is a project which we completed. It was a proposal, never got built, but a wonderful project in Fournier Street, Brick Lane, for a wonderful guy and entrepreneur, directly in a 3-bay width, which is a 1960s office building, next to a landmarked street. So the way in which in this program to actually put a home here, and the size of this was actually to give back an amenity to the city, to the community, the Indian Pakistani community. So this in effect became a community center that was based with an art foundation overlay of his contemporary art collection, with a foundation that's then mixed into also a private home. And about 30% of the total development is a home. 70% was for offices, for some foundation work, and then for this community center. So for us also, even in residential, smaller, larger projects, to think about the private house and the way in which, after being involved for years with interior space in Manhattan, it's the way in which you start and the way in which you a lot of times open a studio, is either in essentially retail or interior renovations of lofts and things like that. But for me, the meditation is that the way in which you plan and think about the private dimension of life, the way in which you can build in health and well-being, the way in which you can actually build in air, light, and sound qualities into space that have a resonating quality to them. The Pantheon in Rome, that is what I call a kind of proverbial iconic space. It's iconic because it's gone through life, through about 1,500 years of life, by changing not only where it was, but also what it was. But still, you go into that chamber, and you have that floor, the proportion of that light, the opening. There's something that is so organic and so either disturbing or kind of euphoric about a space like that. I could say the same thing about a James Turrell sky space. It's the same thing. If you haven't seen a James Turrell sky space or sky light piece, it is actually that. And also the Pantheon obviously was going directly into the Bazar Kala, and that could lead in a whole discussion about culture and pleasure. And so for me, what we try to do in our projects is actually to edit and reduce. Yes, perhaps I began as as part of a minimalist tendency in work, but the way which then, when you begin to think about an interior, and then a home, and then begin to plan for residential development and sort of high-rise, like in Manhattan, where this is a development which we're now working on for individual floors in Manhattan, in a old McKimmey and White building, which we're going through different studies. But the way in which also we're developing a narrative at the base, which for us become a way in which to develop this idea of memory and also presence, and the way which whatever reference it is or whatever experience that you have which draws you to being a designer, architect, urban planner, lighting designer, graphics, whatever it is, there's got to be something that generates and focuses your vision on what it is that you want to do and what forms attract you. So what we do is that we work with our projects. This is a project for that we're currently working on in the Maldive Island. It was a 1930s sort of very early sort of eco-resort. And a Singaporean developer has taken it over and it's being turned into a new eco-resort on this small island of Festu. So this for us is the way in which this is the trailer, if you want, for this project. It's the way in which we work, which is very intuitively, but also very specifically about a large encyclopedic image to start out with. You know, your 300 hours of film to get to your 2.5. So that for the way in which we think about sort of shelving or hanging, or the way in which we can think about a sort of meander, that this is a project that was developed as now community. So how do you think of not just the interior of the home or apartment of the house that's now part of a urban city, but also now part of a community? So how is a designer given opportunities that, you know, it's like pulling straws sometimes about what jobs that you actually get, and the 30 or 40 percent or 50% sometimes that you don't get, and how then can you continue to sort of express yourself and focus with a sort of will in a way, so that this as a kind of essentially branding exercise for an environment that you can arrive and to have this unwinding experience, to lounge and with your lover to kiss, because that's usually what you're there for, to relax, and to be coddled and to look at things that are atmospheric, and to wind down, and ultimately to return with a meandering rather than a straight path. So in other words, how do you design something that simply will make people relax and give them back some simple things about being in a beach environment or water environment that can be sort of self-fulfilling? So these are these ideas of these beach pavilions, almost like baskets washed up on shore, and also different nautilus-shaped sort of spas and different communities of space that link one from the other. We've been involved a lot from very early on, which for me, theatrically and also scenographically, was something which I have to say I learned here. So when I entered here, of course it was the height of Alvin Boyarsky and what he put together with Ram Koolhaas, Elias Zenglis, Dalibor Vesely, the whole lot. And learning through Koolhaas this whole notion of narrative and the scenographic overlay, essentially stemming from filmmaking and scenic writing. And so for me, it was not only from that experience, but also something prior in terms of just also enjoying at a very early age writing, and writing narratives and writing stories, and then in the end, writing about the spaces that I'm trying to create to understand if what we're doing is something which has the leg to stand on. We began this series of spatial branding exercises for fashion designers. And fashion designers, for me, are simply having a very intensive, creative conversation over a long period of time with somebody who is at their game. We began first some experiments with Jil Sander on some projects with her starting in 1990, spanning through about 2005, over about 80 boutiques, which we did for the design house, small and large. And the way which you would look at the spatial dimension of space to immediately declassify, delink boutique with commercial, and to say, you know what is in here is craft, what is in here is discipline, and it's called fashion. And each fashion house, if it's a good house, has their signature unique design, sensibility of pattern cut, the way in which a garment moves, the way in which it doesn't move. And this coded DNA that for now, and for a lot of careers of colleagues of mine and quite a few architects, the way in which fashion and art has always been linked through, I would say, at least the last 2 decades. And through that, a kind of resurgence or an evolution in the way in which fashion designers finally understood the value of design, and the way in which a space, for the whole purpose of propelling the business ahead, which is not selling wholesale, not selling to department stores, but actually setting up your own retail space that you could control your own selling points, but also then, because of that, have a theater and a scenic and a brand overlay as to the house of Jil Sander, the house of Armani, and the way in which then you begin to think as residences, branded space. So we began these series of exercises, starting with Paris, and the way in which everything, from simply the geometry of Jil Sander, it was a point, a line, and a curve. Point, line, curve. And what is that? That is dance. So Jil Sander brought to us saying, I need a space, and this is the kind of rhythm which I'm looking for. And this is kind of like the texture that I want of the space. Something that is pure, but something that is highly active, like a dog whistle. So something at a pitch which not everybody will get. But to keep it, obviously then also something that as a space was also thought about as inside and outside, and having this simple polemic and simple play of saying inside and outside can be switched. So a Jil Sander space actually was thought about, the project which we did in this, nice old building. 1740s, 250 years of existence, of being private residence, of taking 150 years to actually get formed into 4 buildings, which then became Bank of Scotland, to actually cover the courtyard that then became the banking hall, etc. So to actually use all of this sort of history, and to treat history as something that is not nostalgic, but something that is ever changing, simply polish it up and put something else in it, which has now a purpose for being there. So for us, the Jil Sander London space was actually thought about as a sunlit courtyard, to actually return it to what it was. And that was the simple idea, and it's just simple. So for us, we treated it where we brought in just these, let what was there, but obviously we intensively restored this thing with, a committee of hundreds and a cast of hundreds also. But the way in which then a project like this, from a preservation point of view to a brand point of view, to what Jil Sander should be and how she should express herself and how she feels in London versus feeling in different places. A Milan showroom, which was a 1940s theater, which was her main design showroom. So something which is then, whenever for us there is not any history to work with the exception of these amazing exterior walls then our view is, you know what? It's a modern world, and we get to do what we want as designers if it's responsible, it makes sense, and it's going to last a period of time. Why? Because there is value in things that last. So how do you put together things that are still decorative or still more embellished? This is a project for Nicole Farhi in New York. I believe you probably know the brand here, and you know Nicole Farhi. Wonderful personality, actually exceptional detailing for women. And the way in which we repeated but actually put into a space, which was a landmark space, Edison Hotel, 1900, became the Copacabana Latin Jazz nightclub, 1930s, an absolutely amazing establishment in jazz in America. And then in the 80s, went down, and we luckily found this space that was on the market for 2 years, and she went in, she did it, she took it. So then what do you do, and how do you then treat a program, which then included Nicole's bar restaurant with ready-to-wear for men's and women's, and also her wonderful home collection of stuff that she collects. So very personal, but also to not embellish where there's no history, and not to recreate history for the sense of having something old. There's never anything worse or unappealing, is that when decoration has no irony. So at least if you're going to decorate either really well and imitate, or once you know how to decorate, and I consider myself a decorator as well as I consider myself an architect, because decoration is a very difficult thing to do. And architects certainly don't know how to do it. And a lot of interior designers don't know how to do it. For Armani, then, it was developing this 100,000 square foot emporium in the way in which actually for the city of Milan, we had to introduce 2 streets, public streets inside. So in effect, the Galleria. And for other brands, the way in which also for us, light in and of itself is infused with a sense of individuality. So for Ferragamo, for Jil Sander, it's northern light. For Armani, it's sort of eastern and then very late twilight, western light. For Ferragamo, it is the Florence, and it is that light. So that for all of our brands, for Nicole Farhi, it was like this steely blue mixed with amber. So for all of our clients, there is this sense of color, usually not through paint, but usually through an understanding of how light from day to night can transform space without having a sort of silly, a computerized color wheel that turns turns the rainbow every 15 seconds. This is a project, wonderful project, when our office was very thin, and essentially it was like 4 months ahead, or that was it. It was going back to get a job. And this was a client in Chicago, Joan Weinstein, an amazing specialty retailer, a curator who brought in very early on Rei Kawakubo, Yohji Yamamoto, all of the European Terry Mugler, and then also supported and was one who initiated the career of Zorin and Richard Tyler and some of the other really wonderful designers in America. So this is a little emporium space off of in San Francisco, off of Maiden Lane, and off of Union Square. That's what I meant to say. 2-story, a kind of landmark building, gorgeous cast iron, and she said, it needs to be red and it needs to be dramatic. And up to that point, I was doing 12 years of white. And, with a little, going a little into, gray, but it was white. I knew white, and I could color space. And so, okay, I'm going out of business in 4 months. And so somebody I was thrown a lifeline, said, make it red and very dramatic. So this is the first time I can say that I certainly did have a design out-of-body experience because I didn't know what to do. And so the way in which I know what to do is to then go back and think about all those things in terms of art history. For me, that's the reference. And all those artists that actually did red or any other kind of culture that does red. So with each of these projects, we also have this trailer, these concept images that go through it, so that not only can we not sort of like faint from not being able to do something which you don't ordinarily do. So how do you expand if you're allowed the opportunity? I haven't done landscape before, but over the last 8 years, we're now doing landscape design, working with, of course, designers, but also helping to initiate and take control, if it's a house, if it's a building, what the landscape can be. We have extensive experience working with contemporary art. Exhibition design is a river that runs through the studio. So beyond my background in sort of fine art and sculpture, I apprenticed for many years, both in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and then earlier on in New York in theater production, essentially working for theater productions, and then beginning to get employed for advertising companies that need theater production experience, but going into the service of facilitating artist projects. And that for me is, even beyond thinking about residences, it's something which is absolutely the most challenging, absolutely the most rewarding. And that's it. It's that bad and it's that good. But it's something that we found through the studio. We have, probably about 12 different languages now spoken through the office, just like many offices now are. And how you then instill in the group of people that you're working with not only good spirit and camaraderie, but also some way in which to keep the tone of your studio in terms of sensibility at a really good pitch. So it's just how you think about, and just like on a violin or on a cello, just how you maintain tone, or through singing, the way in which you maintain pitch. And so for us, it's always a juggle and a constant struggle. And we found that through bringing artist projects in the studio, because it's something which is very liberating, because they're not our projects. We're facilitating most of them. But then also what we're doing is that we're providing an overlay with exhibition design for smaller or larger things. We've done a number of projects with the Guggenheim Museum, and also working with artists such as Namjoon Paik in this retrospective curated by Germano Cilant, and also for Matthew Barney and the Cremaster cycle throughout, the way in which the space does get transformed, or it doesn't, and the way in which in a space that is so iconic and organic and maddeningly stubborn as this space, that in the end there's only a certain kind of art that can go into it, and it's good art. So how you describe it, what value you place on it. But artists react to the space in a very visceral way, because it's tough. But if the art is also tough, if it's meant to be there, I mean, if it has its own presence and its own, if you want, trajectory in terms of memory, past and present forward. This was a show that we worked on, Singular Form, a minimalist survey, both minimalist and post-minimalist. So obviously some works that you can recognize, Bob Gober Ronnie Horn this piece called Flannery, and also a wonderful installation of Rachel Whiteread. So we've been working with many artists in actually providing support. Believe it or not, artists sometimes are not their best client, because they are their client. They have no responsibility other than just to say to themselves, this is my world, and if I can understand it and really develop these vocabulary, these languages within languages. I mean, if you know Matthew Barney and the kind of layers upon layers, or Saigao Chang, this piece, which is these 3 Toyota engines that harness this Santa sled of goat stomachs, and these are all traditional Chinese apparatus for travel. So for us, it's entering into this very conceptual and fantasy land of language and just pure artistic expression that doesn't have boundaries and doesn't have a client. And that's where also I think sometimes designers or architects can also, you need to be careful. Because, yes, I mean, I suppose that architects can be artists or designers can be artists, but one thing is liability and also responsibility to this very, very vast network. It's a theatrical production, as you all know, in the way in which you produce things. So for us, I mean, this is something that is a very nice vehicle. And it keeps the studio kind of like percolating with just meeting different people. But also, artists don't also understand well space. Not all artists do. So we, as well as a few other studios, we had it's called Open Studio. And the way in which artists, if they're doing a project in New York, or they have a project, they're a New York-based artist, but they're doing a project in another part of the world, we can actually input the stuff with CAD. So we have now actually a kind of database of many, many different international gallery spaces, public art spaces, and also museums that we've input. And also we make available for other artists to get a model of space and things like that, or artists to come in our studio and actually say, okay, this is what I have to fit into this area, can I do it? So it's a kind of service that we provide, as well as then different types of exhibition projects that are about different disciplines. This is a fashion accessory group that decided that they wanted to have a presence running correspondingly to the New York fashion shows. So this is a Raymond Hood building, an absolutely fabulous building. It's now the Park Hotel by David Chipperfield. So it's a red and black image. So these are these very, we do a lot of exhibition design, still theatrical, but also offer all these different companies that this stuff goes up and down and thought about and actually complete in about 6 weeks. So the cycle is very, very quick. And we must do about probably about 10 to 15 of these projects. In addition, we're invited then also by different companies, the Swarovski and the Crystal Palace, to think about crystal. And I'm sure other of you have seen different designers that have been part of the Crystal Palace sort of series. But essentially, it's the Swarovski family, which invites you to go to Innsbruck and then to Wattens, where they're from, to go to Crystal Town. And to really think about also how chandelier can be reinterpreted. So for us, it was thinking about Gansfeld and thinking about these spaces of not isolation, not deprivation, but actually enhancement, sensory enhancement spaces from 1930s. And this was creating a cone of space with obviously these refracted qualities, but on these essentially stainless steel fishing lines, and with one little fan, which puts all the crystal to motion and essentially sets off this sort of moving chamber of refracted light. And you entered on this platform, which is like a little pond mirror on these little B&B rolling dollies, these little discs, to look up at this chamber, the sort of sky chamber. And then the studio has always worked on urban projects and different competitions. We probably do about anywhere from, I would say, about 10 to 12, what are now sort of medium-sized to major competitions a year, just to keep that exercise going. And this is a project which we won in 1995 for the island of Isola in Verona. Essentially a 500-car parking garage, which was a sister city, obviously, of Venice, which was a canal which went through. So it was the river. And it was landfilled in the 1930s into a bus pavilion and market, and the whole area went down. So the whole idea was to essentially give a 500-car parking lot with creating a new park and bridge over from the main cathedral in that part of old in Verona. And then to bring the water back in, to actually create and allow the Meriglioni, these walls to exist. So running walls, running water, and creating different effects. So these are things that we on purpose decided to take on. We happened to win this. Unfortunately, like in typical or more typical Italian style, there are very few competitions that are actually sponsored and then won actually are built. And there are a number of projects. Actually, we've attended a number of conferences on the very fact in Italy to that effect. But essentially for us, what this is simply about interior space. It's all interior design, the way which we're thinking about a parking lot as an amenity. It's part of the urban place. It just happens to be underground. And it's actually entering conceptually underground into what was a flowing river. So for us, I mean, we like to use a sort of narrative through different projects and competitions that we take on. So we blend in this trailer and the narrative and the weaving into this symphony hall and offices for the government of Quebec in Montreal, and the way in which this whole idea of the earth and of a very specific kind of a geological shifting of these basalt plates led to this investigation of basalt and the kind of crystallization of quartz and things from salts and water that are in it, so that each of these programmatic components are kind of thrusting or growing or kind of like oozing amber sort of bars of programmatic intent. And we've done a lot of different projects to thinking about flight in a different way for a European character, and the way in which a good night's sleep, or the idea of perception, or things that are atmospheric or celestial, or the way in which simply, to have that kind of like beehive of experience, but the way in which actually, you do feel like a moist tulip in a terrarium a lot of times. But the way in which you think about work, or sometimes the way in which you think that, when you fly, you feel fuzzy. Not knowing wanting to eat or drink, or what kind of light or activity, or how you can sleep. So for us, we codify the activities and then overlay images that convey that activity to then frame our response to specific space and volume and programmatic conditions. For Car Showroom in Japan, which is both car showroom and cultural center and museum, like their department stores, where at the bottom is the department store and at the top is a museum. So the way which in Japan they're very accustomed to vertical culture, vertical kind of amenities, mixed-use developments that absolutely define or redefine what high-rise development actually is. And so this was a project which is just this kind of incubated Generation X project that for the moment it's on hold, but how to define an interior space that's essentially two outstretched hands holding this world of automobile and movement and design as a kind of dynamic force to sort of control and harness with a particular brand of automobile. And so these are these shells and different activities. So any activity for us is worthwhile to show. So creating these sort of vertical carports and also entries, and of course the sort of experience or space set inside different pods. And then different retail projects which we're working at master plan to develop. This was for a next generation store for Saks Fifth Avenue in Boston, right in a very historic area, to reconceive two levels of shopping, not as this kind of experience of the department store, but the experience of a fresh market, of indoor-outdoor spaces that were absolutely indoor and outdoor, and the whole notion of a screen or a front, or the way in which you think of things in terms of where the goods come, or like the docking of the goods, and really thinking about then this as almost like the upper two floors of a classic ocean liner moving through space, but with the performance of today. So in our work, there's a lot of performance in terms of like the value of how you sort of set up space, the kind of charge that the space that you set up may have. Should it be very soft? And what's again the pitch of a space? Is it a bathroom? Is it a master bedroom? Or is it something like with this project, which is our addition as this kind of like luxury barnacle, which is attached of 100,000 square feet, but a 7th-floor project to a 1 million square foot shopping center that Westfield is developing and is now going to complete in White City. So this for us is an exercise, current project in New York, now in construction, in which this was conceived as this, the plan as this Venetian mask, but with the performance of a racetrack, so that there's an understanding that program and the way in which you set up space, what's next to what, and what is the relation? Are they fixed? Are they flexible? How do the business units, profit centers, plus also scenographically, how do you set up very distinct components? And this was a lifestyle center going from 2 lower level VIP lounge and parking through 2 levels of retail and lifestyle to then an entertainment floor and then also for spa and health. And the overlays, these are not current, but the overlays of, for us, creating the sense of a meandering space, in effect creating actually a cycling track and an overlapping almost figure 8, so that there is no beginning, no end, and we actually limit the kind of procession in any one way over a short period of time. So what I thought I'd do is simply choose a project small and a project larger in a public way that are more current, just to show a little bit more process of this idea of, for us, kind of interior memory and also spatial enhancement in the way in which, again, simple things, proportion, air, light, sound. And with that you have a ecosystem, you have a terrarium, you have life. Now it's a question of how you overlay it and how you also think about embellishing that life. First project is an art project that we facilitated for the Guggenheim Museum, specifically curator Nancy Spector, for this last Venice Biennale, for the American Pavilion, in which she chose as her subject Felix Gonzalez Torres, which she had previously curated a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And so this was actually a well-timed, if you want, not revisit, but a kind of evolving in terms of art and the language of contemporary art, and why there have been quite a few artists that have been affected and actually influenced with Felix Gonzalez Torres. An artist of Cuban descent, lived in America, died when he was 38, a very strong social activist, very much involved with the group called Group Material. It was kind of Flanner art group in 1980s and early 90s in New York, doing different social activism. And essentially for him, what he considered is that every piece of art is political, but you don't necessarily think about, when you're making art, political. Whether it is political or whether it isn't, it will, over time, according to him, create it should have a political dimension. Why? Because if it's political, then it has social value. There's a reason why people are getting agitated, or, Damien Hirst. Now, whether you agree with their positioning or not, it is art that is very socially conscious, and also something that what he strove is to think about this whole idea of how art is placed into a public environment, and to allow it to have a multifaceted way in which people read it. However, it was in the end all about this idea of entropy and loneliness, and also loss, because it was about also reaction against the AIDS crisis and different things. And so, for example, this is a piece. Which is a stack of licorice candy. You take a piece, eventually the sculpture and the kind of post-minimal, because he's being very critical also, he's actually being ironic, not ironic, celebratory, sometimes ironic others, of both the art and the mechanism for a piece. So actually all of his pieces are actually depletable. They eventually will disappear. And that is the whole point of this idea of something which is very physical, lovers, and to actually exchange bodily fluids just by kissing or by sharing a needle. So it can be something which is very engaging or very destructive too. And the way in which these stacks, called Republican years, that you are allowed to take one, so eventually it will disappear. Or the light bulbs called Celebration, that eventually, in this kind of celebration of a carnival, or something that you remember, a memory of growing up for him in Cuba, that they will eventually burn out. What we did is that we facilitated the design and building of his work in Venice. Most of you have been to Venice. If you haven't, that is Venice. And this is Piazza San Marco, okay? These are the Giardini. So I thought, why not? I'll give you a little place. This is how we thought about it. This is the Giardini here. This is a closer look of the Giardini, and this is the close-up of that. And this is the American Pavilion. 1930s garden area. Over a very long period of time, different countries have built their pavilions. So this was an installation and a meditation on the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres for a posthumous fountain, which he never built but was on the verge of doing. And what they were two spherical 4-meter fountains, essentially two lozenges. If you imagine Brancusi's kiss, that's Brancusi's kiss. So the idea, because his lover died at a very early age, and it was something that was very inseparable for him. So his work became also meditation on life and loss. So that everything in terms of weight, in terms of proportion, was so meticulously thought about, so that the weight of the two water in this drawings that we created for the mock-up were a proportional value to both of their bodily weights. And so it's this meditation on actually their weight. And their weight as water, what? Over time, it evaporates. So it actually becomes dry, fillet, dry. So it's a sort of ritual, almost like breathing, but of these two hovering, floating bird baths, essentially, and also just baths for kids to play in, something that's also very human. So what did we do? We found a place. We had to get it fabricated. So he said it should be of a local stone. Well, it's lucky because we are in Italy and they have a little stone. So where we got it was, of course, the only place to use stone, at least in this portion, is in Pietrasanta Massa in Carrara. So we've had like 25 years of relationships with working with different artisans and on special projects over the time. And this was something that was very, very special. So this is Pietrasanta, and this is part of Carrara. This is the mountain, and this is where we took it from. And the selection of the block was not that was important in and of itself, but that it just should have this movement, like a river running through it. And this is the actual sort of place where it was finally taken. And it was about 16, I would say about 5, the block which was taken out was 5 meter by 3 meter by 5 meters. Taken down from 3,500 square feet also to a yard to begin working on it. So a lot of our work in this, beyond just, reveling in a wonderful project that does have this very innate poetic sort of nature of renewal and also transgression. It's realizing it. So we have so much fun just with the sources that we've built up over the years to bring to particular projects. So this is this wonderful, only one of two marble yards that has this kind of saw that's obviously a computer-guided lathe that can essentially sculpt anything, and it just cuts these ribbon thin slices out to that. And it may sound like oversimple, but actually they went through 3 blocks of this because the marble, even in the artist's mind, should be operating in terms of the size, not because it's big, but because it's also fragile, because we want something large, because it is something that's public, but at the same time, it should not be easy to construct. So that we actually they broke like 4 pieces. They actually had to go back to the mountain. So we do a lot of this kind of facilitating and also finding ways, even through the thick and thin, and then how to get it there in terms of the barge and also the sort of hoisting of these massive pieces of stone that are simply kissing bird baths. And in this sort of glowing embrace of his world and universe, a sort of meditation on love, life, and ultimately death, and how people interact with that. And the last project is something which, for us, is something which talks about the public dimension of our space in terms of time, and a focus of our studio that we feel very passionate about, because New York is losing its public space, vanishing in this great swath of development from uptown, downtown, from north to south, east to west. And there's in the AIA New York, and also with colleagues, there is a very strong awareness of the dwindling public space of New York, small gardens to Central Park. And so this is a sort of meditation on a public space for us that we were very thrilled to win a competition. And this was opened in 2006, which was the reinauguration of the observation deck on top of 30 Rockefeller Center in New York. And for us, this was a project because we've been working with Tishman, Speyer, developer, for over 12 years on 5 different projects. But this was a culminating project because we worked as a retail master plan to look at the base of the center and how just through movement and what you put up in the public space can sort of activate a more dynamic and positive flow of people, lighting and sound that was added to it. But this was this sort of wonderful meditation on a wonderful place to view New York. And that's really what it was. To actually think about it, when the deck was launched at 30 Rock Plaza by Hood, Harrison, and of course Reinhardt, and the current owner, Tishman Speyer, with Jerry and Rob Speyer, took it over in 1996 from the Japanese, and from this point they have been really redeveloping and actually restoring a lot which had been taken out. Of course, it was opened in 1993. It's 850 feet high, 70 stories, and it's directly on top of the Rainbow Room. And once the Rainbow Room went into renovation in 86, the deck closed because the operator just decided not to operate it. So it had been closed for over 20 years. And we increased the area 3 floors below and 3 floors above. And it's a project which essentially is getting people from 0 to 850 feet and back down in 40 minutes, and 2 million of those a year. So in the end, all it's about is also how you plan and strategize and design in this vertical transportation in order to do that. So, center within the city of what this is. Obviously, it was developed with a very strong influence, yes, at the height of its Art Deco and Art Moderne influence, but through the trip which the Rockefellers took to Egypt. So all of Rockefeller, the entire 14-acre, 12-building campus is not only Art Deco, but it's Egyptian-inspired Art Deco. So for us, and nobody seemed to make this connection before, this is 30 Rock. This is the, as you see here, these are this is 5th Avenue. Okay, so the whole center goes east to west, the only development of its kind in New York that actually straddles that, and forms these fingers with the international buildings on the front, these wonderful buildings that look across to Saks Fifth Avenue and are about 7 stories high, where they form the channel and the canyon of Channel Garden, which is the main perspective that you see the Christmas tree and everything from that. So in fact, for me, it is the Sphinx. I mean, it is something which, in terms of the feet and the connection to the top, from the back, from ground to top, again, how this has been always seen as something which was meant as a pinnacle and a view for public viewing, not corporate viewing. Rockefeller Center, of course, what we do is that we throw ourselves into any history, but also programmatic identity from the start to the end. So the launching of the observation deck, that we spent about 3 months just in the archive alone at Rockefeller Center and also at the Rockefeller's personal archive, finding this image, and this turned out to be the inauguration of the observation deck 2 years after it opened in 1935. And of course, Radio City Music Hall with Roxy, the Rainbow Room, Channel Gardens, the skating rink, and of course then these very lofty lounges and public lounges for you to view the city, inside and outside. So for us, we were hired as an interior designer. It's kind of nice. Spectacle and view. So the idea that this was, at its inset, a sort of aspirational pinnacle, literally a piece of granite chiseled across the axis of Broadway that straddles this kind of calcified 3-story 1930s ocean liner in the air, which the Queen Mary was supposedly one of the examples. And you see these wonderful details of just a trash container, all these influences of this luxury liner deck, but for the public. And it's the topping of the steel, and of course it's always adversarial role with King Kong and the sister building down the other way. And this is the upper deck, at which there were actually lounge chairs and plantings and for special events, and also for viewing. This is looking due west across Brooklyn directly towards Long Island, and on a clear day you can see Long Island. To just the fashion, and for us we love to know about how something was run when it was actually first opened. And we found all these photographs to, of course, all these guides. It was the first complex in America that actually came with guides. That was outside of a museum or some other civic place. This was a corporate place. But how, through the kind of artists and artisanic sort of tradition that was sort of built into this, these Ask Me guides were invited and trained to tell you anything and everything that you wanted to know about Rockefeller Center, from the ground to the top. So for us, of course, all you have to do is to not scratch the surface. It scratches for you. It just pushes back. It is a very imposing, extremely majestic piece of limestone that is just encrusted with some of the best artisanic work that has ever been done in America. We will come back to this, but this is this cast glass entryway to 30 Rock Plaza. All of the Art Deco fascination with history, with myth, with Zeus, with this whole idea of, obviously, natural form simulating environments, a sort of fantastical element that only Coney Island, as a kind of sister development, could probably compare. 45 Rock, probably one of the best lobbies in certainly in Rockefeller Center, not only in New York, in my opinion, in America. Because it is something that is not imposing, it's very grand, but there's something so intimate and charged with the space, and the way in which also the kind of reflection of this Harry Bertoia a piece from like the 1960s that was put in. It wasn't original, but actually transforms this space. To just this incessant viewing of what Art Deco is, and the way in which we don't know anything about Art Deco. I'm not an Art Deco designer, so how do you get into Art Deco? Well, here you just have to walk, and you have to talk to different people that know about the building and show you different images. This will come back because this is actually a ceiling design which we did in the decks. But infusing it in all of the different artisanic screens from design, from the metalwork. These are the cast aluminum panels on the building. It is an abstraction of lotus and papyrus. It's Egyptian deco. To patterns, a French deco pattern, to this, excuse me, kind of almost a steel but deco pattern. This abstraction and fascination with nature and how it becomes mechanized, almost prototyped for the new age. So we went back and actually scraping that off to see that it is about this crystallization and the way in which in a design of that period, in tea, in art, in a piece for a sculpture, in glasswork, in a Parisian bar, in a Japanese fabric for kimono, to a Dutch furniture piece. There is this thread that went through it. So I'm sure that all these designers were not all integrated, but somehow there was this sort of sense of this kind of crenellated environment, crystallized environment. So of course, I couldn't, I had to go back, digress for a moment, with, of course, Koolhaas's manifesto, but of course then with Madeleine's overview, because that book was nothing without her illustrations and what, in terms of this psychological sort of drama that we could pull from. And so I brought Delirious New York into my studio, and of course no one knew of Delirious New York if they weren't my age or maybe 10 years older, but that's where it stopped. And so we brought Delirious New York back into the studio simply because of his image and of course the whole passage that Koolhaas has in the treatise of Manhattanism and of what a skyscraper is, that it is something which is mythologically charged. It is something that is absolutely this exotic creature, the sort of Japanese sort of anime characteristics. But then for me, just in terms of narrative, of course, how my observation deck as a beacon of jealousy to the rival Empire State with a very coy and diminutive Chrysler building, and with the Goodyear blimp, of course, as a with Central Park and all these symbols, but in the event that this voyeuristic nature of the metropolis of New York, and out the window, of course, is Central Park as the viewers, as this continuing urban spectacle is going on. So for us, it's this slab of limestone with a program which says, let's develop 3 floors of entry with a shuttle elevator experience to the top, developing top 3 floors, with wayfinding going from one block to the other. So it's an urban wayfinding program, as well as then a vertical transportation system. But obviously, then it's overlaid with individual programs, individual chapters for me as these individual programmatic books, narratives that are simply layering space with use, with function, but then to overlay it theatrically with light, sound, and excuse me, light, sound, and materials. So what we did is that we created a lobby, again, which you just buy tickets. You go in, you buy tickets. To think about it as anti-commercial, to not think about it as Times Square, but to think about it as a 1930s grand lobby. So it's a lobby that was basically instilled in the time and built as an original, with influences for us to really treat this as a solid piece of limestone that's sort of core drilled, almost like a cave that finds a stream, calcified stream of rock crystal. So limestone is essentially pressured sand, and it's calcified water. That's what quartz is. So the idea was to find these two strains of crystal by carving out its core, one at the bottom and one at the top, with two projects by Sarov, which we were involved with, but creating this three-level space to go down to get tickets, to go up to go to a waiting area and theater, and to then put inside this grand hall this idea of this crystal schism. But on the mezzanine, which is about 50 feet in the air, to create this undulating plan of these three ovals that were intersecting from front to middle to end in an ever-ending cycle, to hold people, entertain them while they're waiting to go up. And this is what, from the bottom, when you enter the concourse, the view is, from the bottom up, creating this sort of crystal, this matrix of crystals within this sort of Borromini-like hole, like a corkscrew going down, coming up in a dynamic way, just suspending around and floating as a perimeter frame for this pixelated piece of quartz, which in terms of the idea of this is simply to say that from the bottom to top, that it is a rendition or an abstraction of 30 Rock itself. And that is where you're going when you're looking up, which is to the top 3 floors. So it's just putting this like little narrative through as a kind of story, so that details that things are very obviously it's modern, it's not nostalgic, but how you imbue the form of this place with a new thumbprint to not imitate, but to put in a particular spatial vocabulary that's all about details, just detail, and how detail upon detail can have a very subtle ripple effect, and done at least in some coherent way, can have an effect of increasing a spatial presence through use. From the Sky Shuttle going up 800 feet through a shaft, a simple time and space capsule. So it's a landmark. No one has seen it. Even jaded New Yorkers have not seen sort of landmark shaft space. But it's just a simple trajectory going into the decades from 1930s to when you then land through the 70s and different culture. And this is all about broadcasting, because NBC and BBC has been broadcasting there since the advent of radio, to the time in which you come up, that you are then in and on the platform. So the idea is that you go from a mitigated to an unmitigated platform for viewing. And you stop information, you stop wayfinding, you stop buying tickets, and you go then into the platform for viewing. So this granite and the sun and the way in which this becomes not only a observation deck, but it also in the evening becomes an observatory. It becomes something that is quite celestial also. From the 67th floor, that is a new floor created out of broadcasting and old mechanical, to 2 terraces here, to 69 as a second grand terrace floor, and then to the top, which is the pinnacle at the 70th floor. So 67, 69, and then 70, a 3-story climb. For us, getting back to the jealous lover, this idea of the beacon, a kind of culmination of there's rock, at the 800-foot height from Fifth Avenue, from Channel Gardens, sort of culminating in this moment and thinking about it conceptually as a Fresnel lens, as this cut glass, as something that is, has the ability to simply soak up light and push light out, to create a space that has a buoyancy and a connection in terms of its geometric lineage to the past, again, to the Art Deco fascination with Fibonacci, the natural growth and the proportional system of life, and the way in which then in this window in the bottom, which is this cast glass of amazing sort of artistry, the idea to create a Fresnel lens which actually wraps around the core of the 67th floor, which is new. So conceptually, on 67, you arrive on a new floor, and it's this compressed schist of rose and smoke quartz. And then how we codified, how we represented first in Germany with Michael Hammer's an amazing outfit, a collaborator for that works with Swarovski, and we worked with him now on 5 different projects. A metal magician in terms of thinking like a mathematician, but plying steel like clay. And these are sample forms of the making of this interior encrusted sort of geote wall, working with these glass artisans outside of Frankfurt that blow glass. But they also have a day job. From 4 in the morning till 11, it's 2 farming villages next to each other for 8 generations. And then from 12 to 6, they blow glass. And they supply glass to all of Germany, Switzerland, and through the Netherlands for all the cathedrals for stained glass. So we were working with this company, and they're putting actually on our artistic glass, they're putting different treatments of acid, actually painting it on like Motherwell, abstract mural, to simulate a crystalline formation. And then working in the Swarovski sort of studios, and the way in which putting these metal panels together with lighting, with this crystal. And so for Swarovski, it was the first time in their 150-year history that they allowed anyone to, with their crystal, to grind it. And this was something that we had with them for about 1 year of intense negotiations with their branding and marketing people to allow us to do something with their crystal, which were very simple prisms, to just allow it to look more natural. So we spent about 2 weeks literally in the grinding of Swarovski, which is like going into the Pentagon and the 4 layers into the Pentagon. And if you see a certain room or see a certain person, you will certainly not come out ever. And there are people that have been working in the company for about 38 years that are senior executives and have not been allowed into the factory. The intellectual property right of all of their machines and the way in which we think about it. But this is the kind of end sort of result of this crystallized sort of wall that's just a core wall in a space that was never part of it, that was just mechanical space. So we had to bring it into the whole narrative of the original decks in some way. So this was our response to actually create it. And this is the front room, which is now referred to as the weather room on top of the rainbow room, which is just below it. But to create openings in what is that kind of architecture, and to simply allow people to go out the door and to see that view. But then also a year's project in actually working through with landmarks, because this was a historic landmark, not only outside, inside, everywhere, anything you touch. And that this glass and treating it rather than a steel cage so that you defer viewing to put glass up so that it is optical, and it also is simply about weather, how to control weather and how to not have a lot of wind out there. But the way in which, with these sort of optical glasses, that you can, in effect, understand what somebody was when they were in 1935, when people didn't have cars, the height of the Depression, when there was technology just coming in terms of radio, of flying, the dirigibles, the Zeppelins, what it must have been like to stand on this terrace looking out at that park and at that view. So for us, in the end, on the outside, for us it was restoring the terraces and simply putting up eyeglasses, which also have a solarizing capability, so that they're a little bit tinted like sunglasses to control and shape the view. And then in the evening, to turn it into, as it is, this evening platform of lights and atmosphere from above, and how we can think about something which is small but creates a glimmer in miniature of the subject that we have for viewing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent. I wanted to know if anyone had a question for Michael. We can take a couple of quick questions. Okay. Just
We can also just end it right there.
We just
because
go
we've
and
been talking too long.
I guess just in terms of your background as an artist and sculptor, it's obvious we can see influences. Do you currently do sculpture? That's kind of one part of the question, or another art that's separate from this. And when did you feel like you developed? Because you definitely have a process, and it might be a different, project. But when did you feel like you came across your process and your development? How you develop things?
I think it's something which, for me, is just very personal. I mean, sort of growing up with a very fertile sort of design community. Design was something which is just something which was there. But also, I was dyslexic and also left-handed, and I had a number of other issues growing up. But the thing is that when you think about design, for me, it's something which, from a artistic act, it's something which is very different. It's like writing a novel. So this is something that is what I think about when I think about something which is doing something artistic. Then it's writing this screenplay to that novel that can become more about design. Why? Because it simply incorporates all of these other people and practitioners, which for me in the end I really enjoy. So it's something which we certainly do, and I do continue to do sculpture and exercises, which are now more mathematical and less about the land and less about less about pure artistic work. But it is something which for me, the way in which you can harness a vocabulary that artists are just working with worldwide, I mean, in their own countries, and the way which then they are throwing in this kind of, if you want, sort of canopy of sort of knowledge into these different biennales and what have you. And I think that, for me, design is something which is undervalued. At least in America, there is now more of an understanding of the power it can have.